There's a food shortage today and it's getting worse. It's not going to get any better. Back in the 40s, when World War II was taking place, the government and the people of our nation began to do something called victory gardens. How many remember reading about victory gardens during World War II? The reason that they were doing that was because all the farmers there, the government was buying most of the produce of the farmers and shipping that overseas to our soldiers. We had 2 to 3 million soldiers that needed to be fed, so everybody wanted to be part of the war effort, and so they tried to grow as much food as they could in their backyards, called victory gardens. So there was a huge percentage of Americans that were doing that at that time. So a lot of people began to farm that didn't farm before in their backyards or garden. And back in those days, a lot of people, there was a higher percentage of people that naturally knew how to do that too. And it wasn't an uncommon practice. But that kind of dialed away back in the 50s when suburbia came into effect and everybody had these big, nice backyards full of swimming pools and lawns that they wanted to mow, and they didn't want to garden anymore. So now things are changing. Things are getting different. But food is very important to our bodies. If you want to be healthy and strong, and if you want your kids to really grow well, why, you need healthy food. Food, better you, better earth, introducing regenerative agriculture. Now, the scarcity of food keeps getting worse and worse because of blockades that are going on, rising energy prices, fertilizer shortages, extreme weather, increased food loss in Middle East and Africa. Last year and the year before, Africa was hit by one of the largest historical locust plagues that they've ever seen. It ate up most of the food all over Africa, Eastern Africa, where the breadbasket of Africa is, went all the way up through Ethiopia, Sudan, Egypt. It jumped over Israel for some strange reason and then hit into Pakistan and Iran and Turkey. And that went on for 18 months of the locust plagues that were going on. Now that was followed by a huge, intense drought in Africa. The World Food Bank that the UN controls and other people control, they were depleted by the locust plague, and they don't have very many reserves now left. And with the war in Ukraine, that has complicated things because Ukraine is the largest European nation by far, and they're the breadbasket of Europe and North Africa. And they're trying desperately to get those barges full of wheat today and barley and oats and ship them around through the Mediterranean, and they're having trouble doing that, as we've all seen in the news. So it's a very dire situation. Fertilizer prices have gone through the roof. Farmers cannot afford fertilizer today like they used to. And so unless they've been learning how to garden organically, they're in a world of hurt because they cannot get crops out of soil that they've killed with the chemical fertilizers. It's not going to produce anything if they don't have that urea that they've been using in the past. So you can see the food shortages and disruptions are affecting more countries now than ever before in history. And this is graded according to color, and you can see the darker that the colors get, the worse that it is. On the darkest color there's a 30 to 100% increase in food prices over there. In our country there, it's worse than it's showing right now, but it's showing a 5 to 10% increase. I think it's worse than that right now. And it's going to keep getting worse. We have food prices and that are continuing to go up and up and up. We can see right there, that was in 2021. We haven't even seen the stats yet for 2022, but it's going to be higher than that and worse than that. The fertilizer, like I said before, is going sky high in the prices. We just can't sustain this kind of an impact if it keeps heading in the trajectory that it is today. So we need to be concerned. I've been talking about this for 2 years to people in a group that I have called the Band of Brothers. We got to learn to garden. We got to start gardening. And I've been increasing my gardens on our property that we have there. And we have several different raised beds of gardens at our house now. And here's how it all started. Years ago, I was interested in gardening because when I was in 7th grade, my mother asked me if I could make a garden and grow some onions and tomatoes for her. And I said, "Sure, Mama." And so I started my first garden, and it worked. I was surprised. It worked, and I've been kind of fascinated by gardening ever since. In high school, I worked for the largest nursery in Kansas, in Wichita, Kansas, called Sunnyside Nursery. And I got a lot of experience working there of growing different kinds of plants as well. while I was in Oregon, well, I'll go back a little bit here. I was able to, I was in Oregon, and I was a part-time youth pastor out there, and I needed to get a second job, and I answered this ad in the paper that said they need somebody with psychology and gardening experience. I thought, what a weird combination. I took psychology at the University of Kansas, and I've been gardening for most of my little young life. So I thought, I'll probably be the only one that responds to this ad. What a weird combination. 30 people had responded, but they chose me for some strange reason, and they gave me a 4.5-acre horse pasture that had been a horse pasture for 50 years. Imagine all that organic matter in it. I thought, this is going to be great. Then I went to try to plow it up. It was as hard as a rock because of all those heavy horses living on that for so long. And it took me a long time to get that plowed up. I brought in some more horse manure, cow manure from the state fairgrounds and mixed all that up. And we had a very successful endeavor there. I was working for Rogue Valley Opportunity Center. We were working with highest functioning, mentally handicapped, physically handicapped people, teaching them agricultural skills. That was my job. I was the agricultural supervisor doing that. We had social workers working that I would coach and teach, and then they would teach the clients how to garden. We had 3,000 tomato plants that I used as County Extension Agency greenhouse to grow from seed. And we had many other kinds of plants, peppers, corn, all kinds of things. So I had a tremendous harvest every week once they started to get big enough to harvest. And I would bring crates and crates to the local food co-op and sell them to the local food co-op, but I had way more than they could use. So then I would bring all the rest of the crates to the regular grocery stores, and they would buy everything I had left. So people in Oregon, Medford, Oregon, were eating organic vegetables when they didn't even know it. They weren't advertising it in the grocery stores in those days. So it was a successful project. And then years later, moved to Bixby. I got cancer in 2004. They sent me to MD Anderson. They did a lot of surgery on me. They took out 39 lymph nodes out of my left arm. They said I can't wear jewelry, get shots, or blood pressure or anything on this left arm again. They wanted to do chemo and perhaps radiation after that. I refused all that. I said, number one, I knew I wasn't afraid of death for some strange reason. That's one of the benefits about being a Christian. And two, I did not want to get that chemical junk in my body. I said to them, I'm just going to eat organic as much as I can. And I was not a big vegetable eater or anything like that at the time. And I'm going to exercise to boost my immune system. Those two things will boost your immune system. So they couldn't stop me. So I came back to town and I started gardening and trying to find places to eat organic vegetables. It's hard to find places all the time. I started eating salads every day. Wasn't used to doing that before, but after 21 days, I was craving those salads every day. So I said to my wife, I think I'm going to start an organic farm. And she says, well, we don't have money to go buy a farm somewhere. I'm just going to believe God in faith that He's going to give me some land. And sure enough, that's what happened. Some farmers opened up their land for me to use free, and I was able to start an organic garden, and it was called Fresh Farm Laboratories. And there I developed a lot of methods that I'm using today and talking about today about farming. I was selling all the produce to a grocery warehouse that only dealt with organic food, and they in turn sold it to the Cancer Treatment Center of America. So they were eating all the organic vegetables there.
Only hospitals did that. When you're in there, they use so much garbage.
I know, but the Cancer Treatment Center of America, they were feeding everybody just organic. So that was because they knew the benefits of that. Now we're involved with a farm effort. Reverend Chris Beach just walked in the door. Stand up, Chris, and say hi to everybody.
Just sat down. I don't want to stand up.
Yeah.
Took a while. I'm just sitting down short.
You are a tall man in my eyes. Chris and I and Mike Feely and Angus Martin and Caleb Feely, we meet every Wednesday morning out on a farm in the Osage County. It's about 30 acres that we're developing. There's horse pasture there. There's horses. There's cows. There's donkeys. There's pigs. There's goats. There's chickens. There's ducks. There's everything you can name it. Chris has a phenomenal ministry. He and his wife, years ago, they became pastor of Wesley Chapel on Martin Luther Boulevard or Avenue, I'm not sure which it is. And they've been helping the North Tulsa situation for years, discipling young men and women, children, and so forth, doing camps. As a matter of fact, Dawn Farrell, she's worked at the camps there too, a therapist, and it's been a tremendous ministry. I was able to help this year with some of the camps, and so they've been doing that for a long time. So we are creating all this environment on this big farm now to help the kids have good food and train them how to eat good food and so forth up in North Tulsa. So we have an organization called Better Day Farms there in Osage County, and there's an aerial picture. We have greenhouse there, and we have a head house. There's the head house that processes all the vegetables, and this is the greenhouse right there. There's a little bit of a better view of it. It's a 1/4 acre size greenhouse, and we're growing everything hydroponically. And there's the inside of it. There's one of the corners of the greenhouse. There's a night view of the head house. And we're producing a lot of lettuce in there. That's some of the juvenile lettuce. And here's what it looks like when it's full grown. If somebody wants to open up that ice chest back there, I brought a lot of that lettuce with me if you want to look at it. It looks just like that or better. It is. We're getting reports from people, outfits that are buying it. It's the best lettuce I've ever seen. Most of it goes to Oasis Fresh Market there in North Tulsa. We sell it, we give it away. We've really, when we're at full capacity, we're producing 6,000 heads a week out of that 1/4 acre size greenhouse. Now, let me just explain some terms to you. We've all heard, or most people have heard, of the old term called organic. Rodale Institute back in the 40s started, and they really popularized organic gardening with their publication that they had for years. I used to take that back in the 60s and 70s when I was very young. It was the only publication that talked about organic in those days. No chemical fertilizers, just organic fertilizers like cow manure, horse manure, and things like that that's been composted. Then there's something called permaculture. Permaculture is the development of agricultural ecosystems intended to be sustainable and self-sufficient. And so that's another thing out there that's been around for quite a while. People talk about permaculture, and it's something that they plant, like they like to plant a lot of perennials, like for instance, Jerusalem artichokes, rhubarb, things that keeps coming up every year. Sustainability has been a big catchword in these days. The ability to maintain or support a process of continuously over time. And so we want things to be sustainable, not something like you just got to redo it all the time. Hydroponics has been another big catchword. That's what we do in this greenhouse here. It's a hydroponic greenhouse producing all this lettuce. We're not using any soil. We're just using water through a thin film technique through gutters that the plant's roots are hanging in. And then the nutrients are in that tank. We have two more than 1,000-gallon tanks under the floor of that greenhouse where the solutions are mixed and so forth. We're going through all the different government regulations, and it's been very arduous. And we're going to become a certified organic greenhouse. We've got our audit coming up at the end of September, and so everything is going to be organic fertilizer at that point. And then aquaponics, a system of aquaculture in which the waste produced by the fish supplies nutrients for plants grown hydroponically, which in turn purify the water. The word aqua means a water culture, and ponics means there's no soil in it. It's just all water. Aqua is like for instance, when you grow fish in big vats or in ponds, that's aquaculture. But aquaponics is growing the plants because the fish waste are being produced in the fertilizer for the plants. We've been doing that for quite some time. My wife has had to put up with me with my experiments. I have in our sunroom, I have gutters in there where I've been doing this for over 10 years. I have outside on the north side of our brick house, but the neighbors can't see this, don't worry, I'm not making a nuisance out of myself in my neighborhood, but I've got gutters going down zigzag down the north side of my house attached to the brick wall that's got the nutrients of the water coming up from the fish tanks below. And I found out back a few years ago, about 10 years ago or so, we had 3 years of bad drought and heat. And amazingly, it's hard to grow lettuce outside gardening in the summertime, at any year. Come on in. And I found out that these lettuce would continue to grow because the water around their roots is constantly evaporating and cooling their roots. Now, Cornell University found out that the ideal temperature for growing lettuce for their roots, for the water temperature, is 72 degrees. So we want to keep that lettuce cool as we can. In our big greenhouse that I showed you a picture of before, we have something called a cooling wall. It's like a great big evaporator cooler. It's like a big giant, going the whole length of the south wall, 4 inches thick radiator made out of a very high, dense, hard cardboard type product. And we have water dripping down through that. And as the fans turn on at the other end, they pull the air through that evaporative cooler. It's like a big giant swamp cooler, if you know what those are. And then it cools the greenhouse. It can cool it up to 20 degrees depending on the humidity. We also have shade cloth over the top of the greenhouse in the summertime, and that also cools. So we're able to grow successfully. And somebody can grab two of those lettuce, the red one and the green one, and just kind of show them to everybody. So even in the heat, I don't know if you realize how hot, but it's been really, really hot the last few days, the last few weeks. You can't grow lettuce outside in the ground, but we're able to grow lettuce very well in this kind of a system. So you pass all that lettuce, just the red one and the green one around, and then we'll throw it away because everybody's touched it. We'll put it in the compost pile. Then we have regenerative gardening, the practice of building healthy soil using carbon, plants, animals, fungi, and bacteria. And that's what we're going to talk about today, because this is what you can do at home. So basically, regenerative gardening and some of the other gardening methods that we mentioned do this as well. They feed the soil by introducing carbon, bacteria, fungi, compost, minerals, plants, soil animals, and cardboard. Has anybody got any extra cardboard today? Yeah, save it. My wife gets mad at me because I save it all the time in our garage, and then I use it whenever I plant another garden. So carbon in the form of biochar and charcoal. How many have heard of biochar? Anybody? Yeah. Biochar is a big thing today too. And that's basically just charcoal. The reason that it's such a big deal, well, I'll get into it a little bit more detail later about biochar, but it creates one of the finest substrates for bacteria to colonize with this extremely high porous surface area. If you look at charcoal under a microscope or any kind of carbon, it has the largest surface area of almost any other types of product out there, and all that is being colonized by bacteria. So you get loads more bacteria growing on carbon than anything else, and that bacteria is doing a service for us. So it becomes a nutrient sponge, it prevents leaching, and it produces a type of terra preta. How many have heard of terra preta? I first heard about it back in the early 90s. I was reading Atlantic Monthly magazine, and aerial geologists were looking over huge savannas down in South America, down in Peru, in the Amazon basin. And they were seeing these geometric shapes across the plains from the air that they didn't notice when they're walking on ground. And they're trying to figure out, what are these geometric shapes? There's like big causeways going to these big circles, and then another causeway, and they couldn't figure out what it was. But now we know what was going on. There was huge populations of native people back in those days, before 100 years ago and further back. And the tropics are known for very, very poor soil. Does anybody know why the tropics would have very poor soil?
Water leaching, because they get so much rainfall.
That's right, water leaching. Because of the huge rainfall, it's leaching all the minerals and all the nutrients out of the soil. So if you go into the tropical rainforest in South America, you'll find a huge network of roots all over everything. As soon as a leaf drops down, the roots attack it, because that's the only way they get their nutrients, and fungus and everything else attacks it, because the rain will come and wash it away and wash out the nutrients as well. So what the Native Americans were doing back in those days, they figured out a solution to that problem. And so they would take, when they'd open up new land, they would take all the compostable trees, leaves, dead matter, and put it in a big heap and pack it real tightly. in the heap. And then they would take wet clay. They have a lot of clay in the tropics because the good topsoil has been washed away. Then they'd take clay and they would make a layer over all this huge heap of wood and leaves and organic matter. And they would make it sealed like a giant beehive. And then they'd put a little hole in the top and little holes around the edges. And then they would light it on fire. And that fire, once it was lit and everything was on fire, they'd seal up all the holes and produce charcoal. If you've ever been to a charcoal kiln place like they have in Missouri and other places, that's how they do it. They're using big metal buildings to do that. And so then they let that smolder there for a couple of weeks until it finally dies down. And then they take their mallets and they start hitting it and breaking up all this clay. Now this clay has been fired, so now it's hard. And so it's like ceramic. And so they break it all into pieces, and then they get all this great black charcoal, biochar, out of these huge heaps. And then they would spread that over their gardens, knowing the bacteria, well, they didn't know it was bacteria. They didn't know what made it happen, but they knew from experience this was going to happen. The bacteria colonize all this charcoal, and they work it into the soil, and that soil became rich black topsoil that they were creating on their own to create huge production for their people. And they would have these islands that they would make. These causeways would go through the swamps and go to those islands, and they'd plant every kind of fruit tree. And that was another thing that was amazing. All the researchers, how come all these fruit trees planted themselves here on these heaps? They found out later it was man that was doing that. And so now we've learned how to do that. So you can go to your grocery store, you can buy a bag of charcoal, make sure you're getting the wood product, not the briquettes, nothing that has any additives in it, no chemicals added. You can buy raw charcoal, and you can take that home, and you can put it in a secure bag, if that bag's not very secure, and drive your car over it and pulverize it. And then you can just mix that into your garden soil, and that is going to create a substrate for bacteria to colonize with other organic matter in the soil, and it's literally going to start growing your topsoil, just like they were doing in South America. Now, some of you folks here have been around long enough to see a new development, a new housing development years ago, and the surface of the ground was even with the sidewalks. And the sidewalks were usually a little bit higher than the ground around it. But then a few years go by, and you'll notice that the ground is higher than the sidewalks. How many have noticed that? Because that soil is growing. It does not take millions of years like you've been taught in school. It just takes a few years. That soil grows naturally and keeps accumulating, getting deeper and deeper. But if you would do it the way I just described, it'll grow faster and it'll be much more full of nutrients and good things for your plants and lawn. So that's one thing you can do. Also, there's all kinds of arthropods, mites, and earthworms and protozoa that are in there with the fungi that are encouraging plant growth. They've discovered in the last 20 years or so that there's almost a separate species of fungi for every plant on earth. They first discovered this with orchids. There's more species of orchids than any other plant on earth. 30,000 orchid naturally occurring on the earth, way more than any other plant. And man has hybridized even more. So they found that the only way that an orchid seed can germinate, because it's so small, it's like a piece of dust, is that there's a certain kind of a fungus that turned out to be unique to that particular species that helps to give it nutrients for that seed to grow. Now, big nuts that we like to eat, like cashew nuts and walnuts and pecans, they have a lot of food in that nut to give strength to those leaves and roots when they start growing. But orchids don't have that. They rely totally upon that fungi, or they just can't make it. So now they've discovered that we need to be putting fungus into the soil when we plant things. And so you can go to your nursery and you can say, where's the fungus section? And they'll show you. And they'll sell you a bottle of liquid fungus or powdered fungus to add water to pour around your trees and your plants and things like that. Because the roots of every plant has something called root hairs, fine little root hairs. Whenever you transplant a plant, it takes about 2 weeks for it to start growing again because you've disrupted the position of those root hairs. And those root hairs take about 2 weeks to grow back before they can start doing their thing and pulling in nutrients for that plant. But then also, there's something that extends out from the root hairs that's pulling in minerals and nutrients too. It's the fungus. So the fungus forms a network throughout the soil, reaching out further than the hairs or the roots to bring in nutrients to that plant. It's an amazing thing that God has created for life to exist on this earth. Now there's a food web where all this stuff is connected together and helping each other and supplying everything. You may not think that bacteria can supply so much good organic matter to your soil, but there's billions and billions of them. And they're a little animal. You know, roly-poly is an animal, and earthworm is an animal. And animals excrete urea whenever they eat organic matter. Just like any animal, they're excreting urea, which is a nitrogen that the plants need. Can you imagine billions of bacteria doing the same thing? They're creating urea for your plants, nitrogen for your plants organically. So they do a great job. Bacteria are very important in this whole process. I began to study 2 types of gardening methods that are on different parts of the world. One's in Germany and one's here in the United States. That gave me some clues to help me to develop and establish in my property growing things regeneratively. And there's something called I can't pronounce it correctly because I'm not German. Any Germans here? Hugelkultur. That means heel culture. And they have a way of putting wood together and make a long windrow of wood and then putting earth on that. And then they plant their garden on that. They developed that years ago and they're still using that some places of Germany today. I have a friend that became the president of the Pawnee Nation. And before that, he was in charge of the seed bank for the Pawnee Nation. And every year they go to Taos, New Mexico, for a large seed exchange with all the different First Nations of the United States. And so it's a wealth of seeds that they have preserved and collected over the years, and they share with each other. So I asked him some questions one day, a few years ago. I said, "You're familiar with the technique of the 3 sisters and how the Native Americans would garden in a method called the 3 sisters. And the 3 sisters would plant corn and beans and squash all together and make it grow. I said, how did your people do it on the prairies? Because I knew that they would plant and then they'd travel chasing the buffalo and then come back and they'd harvest. He said, here's how we would do it. We'd dig a depression in the prairie. We'd put all that soil to the side and dig this bowl out in the soil. Then we'd go around the whole perimeter and finding any wood, any dead plant matter, any stems, anything organic. And we'd heap it all over this depression until it was a huge pile of leaves and twigs and things like that. Then we would take all that soil and put it back on top of that and cover the whole heap with this soil. And then we'd make a depression, a little bowl in the top to catch the rain. And so then we would plant our seeds there, knowing that the rains would come and water, and all that organic matter would be like a sponge. And so it holds that water during the droughts between the rains. And then when we knew when to come back at the right time to harvest, and it would always be there for us. And so that made me think, why don't we do something like that? So that's what I started doing. Now this is the German way, where they dig a trench, they put in logs and sticks and things like that, and straw, compost, soil, mulch, and manure. It's kind of a complicated process. My method is not nearly as complicated as what they have developed there. But I was also looking at not only the German method, but also the Indian method. And they had this technique that they would plant these 3 crops together. Can anybody tell me why beans was an important crop that they plant with the corn? Nitrogen. They're a legume. Legume plants produce nitrogen. They have little nodules on their roots of a certain kind of a bacteria that literally pulls nitrogen out of the air and puts it into solid form that plants can use. Do you realize that we are nitrogen-breathing creatures? Does anybody know the percentage of nitrogen in the air in this room? 80%. 80% nitrogen we're breathing all the time. Can you imagine? Nitrogen that's explosive, nitrogen that is fertilizer. It's hard to believe, but it's true. Here's another interesting fact. What's the percentage of oxygen in our air? 21% is the average, you're right. We use oxygen when we breathe, and we use that for our biological activity. But oxygen goes through a change from winter to summer. In the winter time, it becomes a smaller percentage, around 20% in the winter. Toward the end of the winter. Toward the end of the summer, it's up to 22%. The average is 21. The reason that and this is globally, the reason that it has a wide swing over the whole earth, which is a huge amount of air to go through a 2-degree percentage change, is huge. It's because of the largest forest in the earth. The largest forest in the earth is so huge that when it's activated in the summer, it sucks up all the carbon dioxide around it and takes that carbon and makes it into a sugar that its tissue can use and to grow with it and add more tissue to it. And it expels the oxygen as a waste product. And it consumes so much carbon dioxide that it boosts the oxygen level worldwide 2%. That's huge. What's the name of that forest? Not the rainforest, not the redwood. I know the rainforest has been called the lungs of the earth, but that's a small lung compared to the lung I'm talking about. The rainforest is only 10% of the size of the forest I'm talking about.
Russian tiger.
Well, you're kind of close, but nobody said it yet. It's called the boreal forest. What's boreal mean? North. If you look at the landmass on the northern hemisphere, it's by far larger than any landmass in the southern hemisphere. You look at Canada, how wide it is. It's wider than the rest of North America. The boreal forest, the northern forest, is all through Canada and northern United States. And then it goes over to northern Europe and then over into Russia and Siberia, where it's unusually wide. There's an unbroken spot there of 5,000 miles of boreal forest. The whole forest is over 7,000 miles wide over the face of the earth. And in the summertime in the northern hemisphere, it changes the worldwide oxygen level by 2%, which is amazing to me. Now, the rainforest works year-round doing its thing, but the boreal forest, boy, when that kicks in the summer, it makes a global change. Now, you remember the story of, was it Squanto? Was that his name? That helped the English and the Dutch that were coming for religious freedom to the United States. And they didn't know how to farm. Now, don't you find that strange that, back in those days, everybody knew how to farm. And they were coming from England, a beautiful farming country. And then they went to Holland, one of the best farming countries in the world. And then they came to the United States, and they didn't know how to farm. It's a little bit strange. Here's why. In Europe, they have a zone around the coast, even all the way up into Denmark and all the way into northern Germany and Holland, of zone 8. And then you go a little bit inland, it goes to zone 7. What zone are we at? Does anybody know?
7, aren't we? Yeah.
We're at 7. It used to be 6B, but now we're 7. They're at zone 8. They could easily grow food year-round up there, along the coast particularly. And so they were used to farming year-round. But when they came to New England, where you had your ground covered with several feet of snow all winter long, that's a different story. They didn't know how to handle that. But the natives taught them how to grow a certain crop they had called maize or corn, that they could grow huge quantities of it, and they could store it for the winter. The Europeans found as they came into the eastern part of the United States, in Virginia, if you've ever been to Virginia, it's just valley after valley after valley, that the Native Americans had different kinds of corn growing in each valley. Now, they made sure that each valley wasn't too close to the next valley where they would grow another species of corn. They kept the cross-pollination from taking place. They had about 200 different kinds of corn. They developed popcorn. They developed every kind of corn that we have today, plus more. And amazingly, that was something that they could put up and store for the winter very easily and survive through the winter, and also learn how to live off the land with animals and this and that. So they had to teach the Northern Europeans how to farm and how to live that way. The Native Americans in North America and South America in ancient times were the greatest farmers on earth. They were more productive than any other group of people on earth by far. They had developed more different varieties of foods than any other peoples on earth by a huge magnitude. In South America, they had developed about 800 different kinds of potatoes. We only have a few today in different shapes. And they developed big growing stations where they would have these different tiers going up the mountain in a big circular pattern at different elevations, separated by 8 foot for each tier. And they would grow different crops at different elevations to see which ones were hardy where. They did all kinds of experiments over the many years and developed a tremendous amount of types of tomatoes, potatoes, maize, and many other types of crops that we don't even eat today. So they did a lot, and they helped Northern Europeans. And this is one of those round places where they've developed, and they planted the corn, and the beans are climbing up the stalks of the corn, and there's the squash plants beneath them. The squash plants protect the ground from the sun's rays, and they also help to prevent weeds from growing. So they have their purpose. The corn grows fast and strong and tall to produce the corn, and then the beans use the corn stalk for its pole to climb up. And then the beans are producing the nitrogen through their roots to help supply nitrogen for the corn and the squash. Very ingenious way. There's a little bit more detail on it. Planting the corn after the first danger of frost has passed, and then the beans are planted when the corn is 5 inches high, and then the squash seeds, and that can be anything from, today you can use watermelon, that comes from Africa actually, or you can use squash or pumpkin or things like that, or even cucumbers to do the same thing. So we're going to talk about what regenerative gardening is and how to do it. And so there's 6 different steps that you can use to be able to establish that. Here in Oklahoma, how many here for their soil have clay soil? I do. How many have wonderful sandy loam? Some of you do. It's more scarce. Closer to the river you are, usually you get nice sandy soil. And that's really great to garden in because you get good drainage. Clay does not give you good drainage. Now you saw the Hugelkultur method in Germany where they dig this trench. I don't dig any trenches. As a matter of fact, I have problems with Bermuda grass. Does anybody else have problems with Bermuda grass? Well, this method kills the Bermuda grass and makes it very good to grow on. What I do, I save my cardboard. It has to be just regular brown cardboard. You can't use the colored kind because usually that's coated with a thin layer of plastic. And you lay down on top of the Bermuda grass is what I don't dig. I don't rototill. I used to, but I don't anymore. And I'll make a bed that's going east and west. And I'll tell you why it needs to be east and west. If you don't have any other choice but north and south, you can do that too. But if you want to do winter gardening, east and west is best. Now I'll explain about winter gardening in a minute. That's my favorite time to garden, by the way, is winter. And it's outdoors without any cover, without a greenhouse. Now I'll explain that in a minute. So you get a plot about 3 to 4 feet wide, and then you can make it any length that you want and start laying down 3 layers of cardboard. I found that 3 layers works the best. Number 1, it starts to smother the Bermuda grass. 3 layers persist enough to kill out the Bermuda grass. The earthworms love cardboard more than any other substance on earth, more than leaves or anything. There's something in the glue or something that they absolutely love. So the other thing that cardboard does, it attracts all the earthworms to your garden. Earthworms are God's cultivators. They go down through the soil, creating channels for water when it rains to go down. Also, I like to rake up all my leaves in the fall underneath my trees and underneath my bushes. I don't do it under the trees where you can see them. I put them under the bushes where you can't see them, or I put them on a compost pile or in my garden bed. The leaves stay there during the winter and they protect your soil from freezing. I used to live in Minnesota. Has anybody here lived in Minnesota or up north? The frost, it goes down in the winter so deep, all of the water pipes in Minneapolis, St. Paul had to be 7 feet down to keep from freezing. Now, in the forest in Minnesota, the ground doesn't freeze at all. But in the city, it freezes 7 feet down. Well, not quite 7 feet, because it's about 6 feet down. Because in the forest, you've got all this litter on top of the soil. The leaves, the plants that were growing there that are not trees, that are dying in the winter, and they're creating a blanket over the soil. And then it begins to snow in the fall and keeps snowing without melting until the spring. And so, because the snow in the forest is falling on top of a layer of leaves and organic debris, it's not melting from the warmth of the soil. It's being insulated from the warmth of the soil. And so it stays and stays. And so the cold does not go all the way down through the snow and the leaves into the soil. Snow is an insulator too. Snow stays at 32 degrees around that temperature and doesn't get any colder. So to have snow over your garden in the winter is a good thing. So what that means is that what you would normally think is that the soil is freezing in the winter. That's a bad thing, because all the biological activity of the earthworms, the bacteria, the mites, all the good animals of the living soil cease to work. They may not die, but they're going to go deeper, they're going to get away, or they're going to go into suspended animation and then come back in the spring. And so you're not going to have any production of urea and fertilizer and nitrogen in the winter for those plants. They're just going to be dormant, unless you do what I'm going to talk about to keep your soil from freezing, and you can keep that biological organic activity going all winter long, like it does in Minnesota in the forest floor, by doing the same thing. So the second thing we do is that we lay down the cardboard, and then you put all kinds of wood on top of that cardboard. This is a trench where they were digging in good soil. I don't dig a trench, I just put it on top of the cardboard. They're not using cardboard because they didn't know about that. But that's an example of the wood that you can use. Any size wood, it doesn't make any difference. The bigger the wood, the longer it lasts. What you're essentially doing as you're mounting up wood on top of the cardboard, the more wood you put in there, the more you're putting fertilizer in your ground for the next 10 years. You're fertilizing your garden for 10 years. Think about that. Because bacteria and other soil creatures are eating and consuming that wood and producing urea, producing fertilizer for your plants, all the years it takes to break down that wood. So don't worry about it being too big. I want to recommend, though, when you do the east to west garden plot, that you put the bigger wood on the north side and the smaller wood on the south side, because you want to angle it, and I'll explain that in a minute. So we got the cardboard, then we got the wood on top of that, and then you begin to put kitchen scraps, pulled weeds, compost, leaves, sawdust, anything in between them. Start packing all that organic matter in between the openings between the wood. Get it as full of organic matter as you can. There's an example of kitchen scraps that you can use. The eggshells are good for calcium. Another thing that I add are rock fines. Can anybody tell me why rock fines would be good to add to your soil? Minerals. Who knows what's happened to the minerals in our land here in America? It's been depleted. When the original people from Europe were coming to America and farming, they would farm a plot of land for about 7 years, and then they'd have to clear more forest and get more virgin land that had not been farmed and begin to grow there because they had depleted the land. And they kept moving west and west and west to find that virgin land that still had fertility left, because they were not introducing organic matter like we do today, or at least like you have been doing if you've been gardening already, and how we should be doing it. And so they had to keep moving west to find more land. So what we're doing with this type of gardening, we're feeding the soil. And so I take rock finds. You can get rock finds at any rock quarry. They have a big rock quarry up there in Owasso that you can go there and get a bag of powder, rock powder. That's all it is. And then spread that over your garden plot, and you're adding minerals. You can go to the nursery and you can buy different kinds of rock finds, different types of minerals now, even volcanic, that has different kinds of elements in it that you may want. But there's a lot of things that you can add now. Eggshells is a way to add calcium. That's another mineral too. So then you end up with this. And your plants just grow more robust and stronger because they're organic. If you have a lawn that's organic, it's a lot easier to take care of than a chemical fertilizer lawn. What happens when you use chemical fertilizers for your lawn, for your vegetables, the leaves seem to grow fast, but because they're growing fast, they're weak, and bugs love them. And so if you have a lawn that's organic, it grows a little slower than your neighbor's perhaps, but it's very robust and healthy and super strong. The bugs take a bite out of yours, and it's so tough, they go to your neighbor's yard instead and eat the weak stuff. I'm no kidding. That works. Plants have a built-in bug repellent. They have a built-in chemical system that they produce that if you grow your plants organically, they produce substances that bugs do not like. Not only are they tough and strong and resistant to chewing, they also are unappetizing to those bugs. They'd rather go to a chemical-fed lawn or vegetable garden because those plants are more tasty to them and easy to chew. So that's something to keep in mind.
That seems weird that
Now,
organic bugs would do that. They wouldn't eat good food.
not only that, but plants know how to communicate with each other. And they put out a chemical hormone type substance that notifies the other plants that this bug is attacking them. And then the rest of them begin to do that. And they repel the whole group of bugs.
Whoa.
How many have ever read about that? Yeah, a few of you have. Now, let me talk about winter gardening. I used to live in Minnesota. I never would think about gardening in Minnesota. Then I moved to Colorado and I thought, this is a whole lot warmer on the Front Range than it was in Minnesota. I kind of liked it. Then when I moved to Oklahoma, I thought, wow, it's so warm in the winter here. I bet I could garden in the winter. So I started experimenting and gardening, and I'd plant. I knew there was some vegetables that liked the cool weather, like turnips and like lettuce and like Swiss chard, and there's a lot of different plants that kind of like cool weather, and radishes and so forth. And so I began to plant rows of those in the fall, and then whenever it threatened to get down below freezing, I'd take a plastic sheet and put over it, and then I'd put a blanket over it and protect it. And I started doing that the first 2 years, and then I kept using less and less things because I noticed it didn't seem to make any difference. I even noticed some of the plants that were not covered were still okay. And I thought, wow, I can't believe that they don't even need this cover. So I stopped using any kind of cover. But the trick is, the south slope that I had is that it was getting a lot of sun radiation. And so if you slant your garden that's planted east and west toward the south, 10 degrees it's getting, according to research, it's getting the same sun radiation as 300 miles south of you. So if you have a garden where you're slanting it more than 10 degrees, you can't get wild, you can't get more than 20, you've literally moved your land into Texas. It's getting the same sun radiation. Because the sun, in the wintertime, comes up in the southeast, comes up about this high, very low in the sky. That's why in the wintertime the sun blinds you a lot when you're driving, because it's so low in the sky. And then it sets in the southwest. In the summertime, it comes up in the northeast, way over here, comes up overhead, makes a big arc, and then sets in the northwest. It's huge as far as from season to season how much the change is from south to north. I have a sunroom on the south side of my house. It gets loads of sun in the wintertime. It's 30 feet long and it's 10 feet deep, and the sun climbs all the way up more than half the side of the back wall of my sunroom in the wintertime. It's a sunroom, not a greenhouse, so the roof is not a greenhouse glass roof, it's just a regular roof. But that sun heats that place in the wintertime phenomenally. You'll easily get into the upper 70s, lower 80s on any sunny day, no matter how cold it is outside, just from the sun's heat. I get tons of sun in the winter, but I get no sun in the summer, not one bit, because the sun comes up in the northeast and sets in the northwest. No sun ever comes in my windows in my sunroom on the south side of my house in the summertime when I don't want it. But it all comes in the wintertime when I want it. So if you build a sunroom, never build it on the north side of your house. The best side is on the south side. So what you're doing, if you create, you're going to make a bed east and west anyway.
Yeah.
And in the summertime, it doesn't make any difference whether it's flat or slanted to the south a little bit on your productivity in the summer. It makes no difference at all. But in the wintertime, it makes a huge difference. What happens is that soil is being radiated by the sun, the same amount of radiation as it's getting 300 miles south of you, warming your soil. And it does two things. One, I mentioned before, it keeps the biological activity of your soil creatures alive and thriving in the wintertime. They say organic gardening doesn't work in the winter because you can't get the nutrients released. Well, if you do this method, you can. They still are percolating in that soil, releasing urea and nutrients for your plants in the wintertime. Then, the other thing that it does, it's soaking up heat from the sun. So at night, it's radiating that heat to your plants at night. So it may be getting below freezing around your property, but right over your garden area, it's still above freezing because of that. Now, I use only plants that can take freezing. There are about 35 different species of garden plants that the cold will not kill. They're totally cold hardy. However, if they're exposed to wind at below freezing temperatures, their leaves can freeze dry. So they have to be protected from the north wind by a house, a fence, a hedge, or greenhouse or something. If you plant on the south side of your house, you're great. If you have a natural slope, that's better yet. Now, young men that grew up in a farming family that want to go out and buy their own land and their own farmer, the wise older farmers would usually give their young sons, farmers, some good advice. They would say, especially if they were farmers that had cattle, ranchers, son, try to buy land that has a lot of south slope. South slope, because they knew those pastures keep growing in the wintertime on the south side of the hill. But on the north side, it stays frozen. So they'd always say, buy as much south slope as you can, because that was much more valuable land producing grass and food for your cattle all winter long. Now, this is my attempt to make a little raised bed. It's got a little bit of a slant there, but you can see there what I'm talking about. It makes a big difference. Now, once you've got your wood there in place, hopefully slanted toward the sun, bigger wood in back, got it stuffed with compost, stuffed with garden scraps, stuffed with leaves, anything organic, and then then you want to cover it totally with a few inches of either topsoil or compost. I use compost. Then you put one layer of cardboard over that. That's your top layer of cardboard. That does two things. One, it stops any weed seeds from growing, and it holds the moisture along with the wood and organic debris in the soil, keeps it from evaporating as fast, and it keeps it cooler. It keeps the roots cooler. So it does three things to have that cardboard. The Lord in His wisdom knew that we were going to have a big food shortage, and so He gave us a lot of cardboard to do my method. Then you begin to cover that top layer with a few inches, 3 to 6 inches of either topsoil that's weed-free, that's been sterilized. It's not the easiest thing to come by, but sometimes when you buy bags of topsoil, you can find that. Better yet, compost or wood chip mulch or any kind of mulch, as long as it's weed-free, no weed seeds in it. And that, again, is going to insulate your soil and keep the roots cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter. So here we have the process there, and that's what it looks like when it's all covered, and then you finally get that. Now, how many here are interested in winter gardening? It's literally my favorite time to garden. Every leaf is perfect. There's no bugs in the winter. Every leaf is perfect. There's never a hole in a leaf. It's amazing. And the leaves get a darker color to them, like lettuce leaves that have red streaks in it. And I was confused about that because sometimes plants will get a suntan to protect them from the harsh rays of the sun in the summer, but now we have plants doing it in the winter too. But I found out it's because plants know the darker they are, the more sun's heat they can absorb in the wintertime. Makes perfect sense. Something else happens in the winter that you may not know about. The plants are far more delicious and sweeter. Does anybody know why? If they're grown in the winter. Remember I said these are plants that are cold hardy? God has caused plants to do this, and all kinds of plants do this. They take their carbohydrates when the daylight gets shorter and shorter, and when the temperatures get colder and colder, they take their carbohydrates and begin to convert them to sugar, because sugar is an antifreeze, and it keeps them from freezing. So everything is far sweeter. So if you start sowing your carrot seeds in the early fall, late summer, and then start picking them in the winter, you'll have the sweetest carrots you've ever had. They're just, some kids say they're like candy. They're so sweet. All your vegetables are sweeter in the winter. Now, here in Oklahoma, we're in a southern state, but we're at the northern end of a southern state, so we can have some cold temperatures. Now, nobody wants to go outside and garden when it's snowing or when it's cold and windy, but we're blessed in that at least one day a week there's a decent sunny day. It's nice to be outside in the wintertime and feel the warmth of that sun on your skin in the wintertime, and you need the vitamin D too. That's the day you go out to your garden. That's the day you harvest. And in the wintertime, you're not going to do any planting. Here's what you do. You plant in August at this time of year from seed, you start planting your cole crops. Do you know what cole crops are? Cabbage, cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts. They're all winter hardy. I usually grow my broccoli for 2 to 3 years, each plant, because they don't die in the winter. When you cut the big head off, the nice, beautiful big head, and you cut that off, then it produces these side shoots for the rest of its life that are the same size that you'd see in salad bars, abundantly. So if you keep it alive, the hardest thing is to keep it alive this summer. In the wintertime, it's easy because they like the cool weather. Cabbages love the cool weather. So you start planting from seed in August, this time of year, those crops. Even though it's hot outside, you might start them inside. And then you move them out when it gets a little bit nicer in September. In September, toward the end of September, you start planting lettuce seed. Lettuce it grows to maturity much quicker than cabbage or cauliflower or broccoli or Brussels sprouts. And so you want to get them planted later, October. And I have planted as late as December. I planted a garden in Colorado at my son's house, wanted to test it in Colorado, the day after Thanksgiving. I made a raised bed, slanted toward the sun, in their backyard, planted from seed all these crops. They got a huge crop early the next spring. And all the other neighbors were just starting to look at their catalogs to order seed, and they were eating out of their garden. Because the seed is made by God to go through the winter. And the plants were hardy too. They don't get killed by the cold when it gets really cold. And if there's a snow blizzard or snow, that's just blankets and keeps them warm. So what you want to do is plant a whole bunch of your lettuce in the fall, and then it grows and grows until November 21st. November 21st is 1 month before what? Winter solstice. So between November 21st and January 21st, you're going to get hardly any growth at all. And so your vegetables, your lettuce, that normally when you plant in the spring, you have to worry about it bolting because the day length and the warm temperatures makes it go bolting, go into seed, and then it gets bitter. That will not happen in the wintertime. And they stay there. You have whole beds full of lettuce like this, and you only go out and pick them when you need them. It's like growing in a refrigerator. And they stay sweet as can be and no bitterness to them at all because they're not going to go to seed in the winter. You just go out and harvest whenever you need. Now, you do have to water in case it gets dry, in case there's a long spell with no moisture, but that's not near as often as you do this time of year when you got to water every day. So wintertime is my favorite time to garden. You don't get hot and sweaty, and it's usually harvest. So then, if you didn't get your plants big enough to harvest in the winter, and say you didn't sow your seed until November, well, guess what? Those lettuces, that lettuce and other plants, you're going to be harvesting at the end of February or middle February when everybody else is checking out their garden catalog. So even if you get them in late, you're still going to get a good harvest. Now, this is what these garden beds look like, the cross section. We've got the wood, you've got the vegetable scraps, you've got some green matter, you've got compost, and you've got wood chips, and you've got different things. So it's kind of striated a little bit. And this is pretty much what mine look like when I grow mine. I just use, I have a lot of trees on my property, and so we'll cut down limbs and cut down trees on a regular basis. And then I use the long, straight limbs and cut off the side branches, and I'll use those for sides of my garden beds. Works out pretty well. And some of those go in the garden bed to feed the plants. So I don't let any wood or grass ever get off my property. I use it all. If you don't have enough in the fall or in the spring when people are scalping their lawns or putting bags of leaves by the curb, ask them if it's okay if you can take them, and they will always say yes. And you can get a lot of organic matter that way too. Compost is the heart of what we're talking about here. And when you make compost, you need to have green matter and brown matter. Brown matter is the carbon. That's like dead leaves. That's like stems of plants or twigs, things like that. And then the green matter is your garden vegetables, grass clippings, this freshly mowed lawn, things like that. This is a regular compost, a 3-bin compost that people recommend. This is the add to pile where you're putting all your fresh stuff in there. And then after a couple of weeks, you turn it over. They have to have air. They get compacted. Then you put it over here. And then in 2 weeks, you dig it out and put it over here, and now it's ready, compost. Now, it always bothered me whenever I'd build compost piles that every time it rains, and you got to keep it moist so the bacteria die, and they have to keep the bacteria alive is very important with moisture, so they keep eating up the stuff in there and turning all that stuff to compost. But it always bothered me that the water would run right through the compost into ground with nothing planted on it underneath the compost pile. So I decided to do something about it. And so when I built the Midtown Urban Farm, I made a raised one where it's raised up off the ground about a foot. And I went to Locke Plumbing Supply and I bought 3 30-inch by 30-inch flat trays to go on flat roofs where they put the air conditioning condenser up there that's going to be producing condensed water from the air, and they have to plumb it to run off the roof. So I got these flat trays. They have a little hole in the end with a little bit of a bulkhead there to attach your plumbing to. So then the 3 bins had 3 catch basins under them, elevated. Over them, I had wood slats that had cracks between them. And then I put hardware cloth on top of that and then screen on top of that so that the organic matter is staying up in the compost bin, and when the water runs through it, it's not going to take any organic matter with it. So then it goes into these trays, and then I had 3 tubes coming out of those 3 bins, and then they're all plumbed together into one tube, and then I had a 5-gallon bucket. That's our urban farm greenhouse. Let's see if I can get to that bucket here. There it is. So then I got a 5-gallon bucket here, put in the ground, and I've got a sump pump in there. And that sump pump, whenever it rains and the water is percolating through the compost, it all ends up there. The sump pump pumps it up here to this 55-gallon drum. We built this stand behind the garden shed. We've got 3 55-gallon drums. The blue ones are for rainwater harvesting off the garden shed. And then this one here is for the compost extract. So it all gets full. And then we plumbed both the rainwater and the compost extract to faucets. Because they're up high, we've got gravity pressure. So we have compost extract under pressure and rainwater under pressure. We attach a hose to the compost extract one once a week and water all of our plants, all of our vegetables with compost extract every week. That would all be wasted nutrients otherwise. If you look online, you can buy a gallon of that for over $20. Chicken coop here in our urban farm. We have a miniature fruit tree orchard there too. This is the south side of that house there at the urban farm. And it's very narrow between the houses here, but it's the south side. So we put a little raised bed there, according to the method that we just talked about. It's only about a foot wide or so. And that's where we plant our tomato plants. That's where we plant our cantaloupe plants, our cucumbers, all of our vining plants. Up bamboo trellis, we grow bamboo too, and we make trellis out of the bamboo. And so we get an abundant harvest there on the south side of the house in a narrow area that normally people would not think about gardening from. So that's easy to do. And that's the chicken coop there, the backside. We clean out that where all the litter is from the chickens there. And right there, I don't know if that's my foot or what, it must be. Right behind me is that compost bin. So we just take a shovel, just scoop it out there and throw it right in the compost bin. All the chicken litter, wood chips and so forth. It's a little bit more about the biochar that we talked about before. It's a very valuable thing if you want to add that to your soil to cause topsoil to actually grow faster. And some final thoughts here before we take some questions here. The main technique there is crop rotation. You don't want to plant potatoes where your tomatoes were growing last year, and you certainly don't want to plant tomatoes in the same spot you had last year. Does anybody know why? Because of mosaic virus and other types of pests. If you plant the same kind of a crop in the same plot of land all the time, there's going to be an accumulation of pest and disease. So you want to rotate. You don't want to plant anything in the nightshade family, which is tomatoes and peppers and potatoes, because the pests are all the same for those three crops. So you got to alternate with something like watermelons or cabbage or some corn or something like that. You want to do crop rotation. And of course, we talked about the compost, residue mulching. Take all your residue, like your leaves, put them underneath your bushes in the wintertime. Guess what happens to all the leaves? By spring, they're gone. All the leaves that I raked up off my lawn and put into my bushes, they're all gone by spring. Does anybody know why?
Worms.
Worms! The earthworms come up at night in that soil that's been protected, even in the winter. And when the leaves are moist, they curl them around like a cigar and pull them down the holes and munch on them all winter long. So you're, again, feeding the soil. So think less about chemical fertilizer and more about compost. There's a greater diversity and biological community in your soil there, and also above your soil if you do things organically. You'll attract the beneficial influence. Oh, I'm sorry.
We're all fighting for trying.
Oh, sorry.
And final thoughts.
Does anybody have any questions? Yes.
So, you talked a lot about the importance of fungus and bacteria in the soil. How do you compensate for that in a hydroponic system?
In hydroponics, we also introduce fungus, and hydroponics and aquaponics. It's a liquid that we pour into the big tank, and that's used there too. And it does increase productivity. As you can see, our lettuce, I don't know if everybody got to see those, but there's a whole ice chest full of lettuce there that I picked today. Yes?
What do you do about animals like squirrels and rabbits?
Well, you know, Sue and I have been fighting squirrels at our property for a long time. They were getting in our attic. We trapped out about 6 over quite a length of time out of our attic and go release them out in the wilderness. And now we don't have any squirrels anymore because we have feral cats living in our backyard. Because they'll eat your nectarines, they'll eat your peaches, they'll harvest them before you get to them. Those squirrels can cause some problems.
Apples, they love apples.
Yes. Andy.
Gentleman from Panama talked about using rabbits. You've got chickens.
Yeah.
Is there a difference between the two? Because he was talking about using the rabbits for the fertilizer. You've got the chickens going on. Is there a difference on that?
Yeah, underneath the fruit tree orchard, miniature fruit tree orchard, we have a runway for the chickens. We let them out about 2 hours before sundown, and then they pick up and they fertilize our orchard for us, and they eat the grass. Can't leave them out there too long, for too many days. They'll eat all the grass, and they'll eat any bugs or grasshoppers or anything like that. And then they naturally just put themselves back into the coop at night and go to roost, and then we shut the door. So that's good. Now rabbits, they have an unusual digestive system where they eat their food and then they eat it again after it comes out of them. So it's partially digested food, and it's very, very rich in bacteria, more rich than poultry in bacteria. It's very good for compost piles. But Ben here, he's from Channel 6, and he raises chickens. Tell him about your chickens.
Well, I know the chicken eggs taste better than the rabbit eggs. We've got about 9 chickens, and we let them out first thing in the morning, and they haven't really taking out all the grass in our yard. So I mean, pretty much you said it all. We've got our compost near the chicken coops. We have 2 coops, and we'll put the chicken, you know, waste and everything, and the pine. I try not to overdo it on that pine though. It seems like, because especially in the winter we'll use a lot, so they have kind of a warmer place to stay. But they love the compost. Actually, it's one thing, they actually turn that compost for us,
That's good.
which is really nice. You know, they get in there. I have a 3-bay. I didn't cover my middle one like that, so I learned something about that tonight. And I do need to keep it moist. It is muddy. Like after we had all that rain, I don't know, a month or 2 ago, our compost was beautiful. What can I say about our chickens? We don't kill our chickens, and we don't cull our chickens. We just have 9. Our kids love them. They all got names and stuff, you know. And so we don't have a rooster. One thing about chickens I did learn recently, though, and maybe somebody can help me if they've ever heard of this, but I've never had a rooster, but somebody said they cull their flock, and when the rooster, if you're concerned about the rooster being too noisy, if you live in town, right when their rooster starts crowing, apparently is right when you want to eat it, because the testosterone is starting to build up in that rooster, and that meat will start to get hard, tough meat, right? And so I didn't know that, so that's just another.
I didn't know that either.
Yeah.
Every time I hear one now, I'm going to think about that.
And I kind of wanted to cull them because, you know, you never know what you're going to get if you get a bunch of different kinds. I mean, that could be fun too, but man, I don't know. Beheading is, you know.
Yes.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but with chicken, pig, cow, horse manure, you have to compost it first before you add it because it can burn the plants.
Yes, that's
but
true.
With rabbit and goat, you don't.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with goats, but that's true with rabbits. You don't have to worry about that. The other ones, another thing about horse manure, it's 20% more value to it than cow manure. It's a little bit higher nitrogen and so forth, but it is hot. It's so hot that the old-time farmers would use it to warm cold frames. Cold frame is a little frame that they build and put plants in with a little window frame over it, you know, and the sun would get in there in the wintertime, keep it warm. But they would dig out a trench and put a lot of horse manure in there, cover it with straw and then soil from the plants on top of that. And as that horse manure would decompose, it produced so much heat it could keep that thing warm on a cold night even for a long time. Yes.
Yeah, no, it's okay. Yeah, 2 things. One is that I have a Havanese. It's a breed of dog that is so fast, and squirrels and rabbits won't even come in my yard, and she'll catch the moles too, and you know, so that's really helpful. But my question is, can we come visit this Midtown Urban Farm?
Yes, right now it's going through a big cleaning. All the water's taken out of the greenhouse. The greenhouse that you saw a picture of there, what this was a little tiny plot, I guess, and a little tiny house that had been burnt partially. And so it was totally renovated inside and out to make it look nice and new. But the garage had burned down. They were going to take up the concrete, and I said, no, let's leave the concrete. We can put a greenhouse over that. So we cantilevered the greenhouse out past the concrete slab over this end of it where the soil was, where we could dig out a pond for the fish. So it's totally functioning aquaponic greenhouse, but we're getting it ready for the fall right now. And so it's totally empty. But we can plan that later on. If you sign up on this list, did that list get around to everybody? Let's pass it around. We can let you know.
Who has not signed?
Over here.
I don't think you mentioned the fish, Bob. If anybody doesn't, does everybody know what he's talking about? I mean,
Yeah, the aquaponics.
he's got the
Yeah,
tilapia.
what we'll do, we're going to have another teaching on aquaponics and hydroponics
Cool.
later on this fall, if anybody's interested in how to do that on a small backyard scale. In the house, out of the house, in the basement, backyard, there's many different ways people can do it. Yes?
So this sounds like the Garden of Eden. What's the most challenging aspect of any of this that we need to be ready for? Other than squash bugs.
Probably summer heat is the biggest problem. If we continue to have hot summers like this summer, last summer wasn't as bad, or the summer before, but It's been hard to do it in the summertime here. Now the melons are growing good, like they have the big leaves and they kind of shade the ground. Watermelons and other things are doing good. But it's been hard to keep things watered. But when you do it this way, your garden bed itself will not need as much water as a normal bed. But the heat is probably our biggest problem. Yes?
That stuff that you're collecting from the runoff of the compost, and you said they sell it for $20. Is that humic acid and fulvic acid?
It is. It's got that in it too. When it comes out of this, when it comes out of the faucet, it's a clear golden
Right.
yellow gold color.
And
Really.
people take it.
No, they don't take it. They use
I
it
do.
for fertilizer.
I take
Oh, you do?
fulvic and humic acid as
Oh.
a supplement.
Well, is that in the tablet form, or do you drink it, or
Huh?
do you drink it, or
I
is it a
drink it.
tablet form?
I
And where do
drink
you get it?
They say it comes from soil, but I don't know how they do
Uh-huh.
it.
Now, there's also something else called compost tea. Compost tea is, they take that 55-gallon drum that I showed you, and then they put aeration in there through an air pump, and then they add molasses to it, which is a type of sugar that feeds the bacteria, and then it brews and grows tons of bacteria. Then they use that to spray on the leaves of the fruit trees and the plants and the soil, because it's loaded with bacteria, beneficial bacteria, that colonizes the leaves and keeps the bad disease-causing bacteria at bay. So that's compost tea. We just have the extract.
Have you ever tried a keyhole garden?
A what?
Keyhole garden?
Well, that's just basically the shape of the garden, right?
Yeah, with the compost. In
I
the
haven't
middle,
done it
and
myself,
then
but I've
you
seen it
build a bed
done.
around it so that it gets that runoff.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good way to handle that too. Yes?
Do you implement computer science and like Arduino, like to measure certain elements in the soil?
Yes, that has that's a whole science. They do that at OSU. They have a county extension agency over there by the state fairgrounds on 21st Street. They do that, and sometimes the Master Garden Society that's located there too, they do that for you too. But you can bring soil samples in there. They do that kind of testing. They ship it off to OSU for you from that agency, and then they bring it back and they tell you everything about the chemistry of your soil and what it needs and what it doesn't need and so forth. Now, in our big quarter-acre size greenhouse, we have a laboratory there too, and we have microscopes and so forth. And we do a lot of testing there too to keep everything on track. That's a whole science on its own. We have to judge the pH levels, because the pH level will determine what kind of nutrients are available to the roots and so forth. So there's a lot of science to this. The more that man is investigating food growing, the more science he realizes is behind it. Did you have another question, somebody, or Andy or somebody?
Yeah, I have one. I was just wondering between what you showed us here tonight versus the hydroponic side, which one would you recommend over another, or does it depend?
I think the easiest is aquaponics with the fish, because you determine how much fertilizer you need by how many plants you have, how long your troughs are, how big the plants are, and then I developed a spreadsheet that tells you exactly how much to feed your fish. The amount of food you give your fish determines the amount of fertilizer you're getting for your plants. So there's science in that too. You had a question too?
Google, we're just starting a garden today, and we're making a compost. And Google was saying that if you put the pooper scoop from your dogs, that it takes about a year to compost. So, and they said that it's dangerous because it could produce E. coli and salmonella and all those different things. So what's your thoughts? Can you put doggy poop in your compost or not?
Well, we never do. When you get anything coming from a mammal, not just a mammal, but a carnivorous mammal, like a dog or a cat, it's got a different chemistry to its waste material compared to a cow. Even pigs can be dangerous because they're more omnivorous. They'll eat anything, and their scat or their waste is a lot more dangerous as well. Now, I'll tell you a funny story. How many have ever heard of human compost?
Yeah.
China.
No. No, they do it here. They do it here in Tulsa. They compost it here in Tulsa. Yeah.
Who does?
Yeah, and when you go to the nursery and buy millimite, I think it's millimite is the name of it, that's all human compost.
Really?
And
Yeah, I did hear that they are.
and they compost it here too in Tulsa. Now, now here's the thing about that. If the composting process, a proper compost, if you put the right ingredients in there, right amount of green, right amount of brown, give it a lot of variation and right amount of moisture, you've got to get the temperature up to 180 degrees. 180 degrees kills all the pathogens that are dangerous. If you wanted to use a carnivorous animal, you'd have to be more cautious about that because of the parasites in carnivorous animals, scat or waste or poop, whatever you want to call it, and E. coli. How many have ever heard of E. coli outbreak and they can't sell you lettuce or romaine lettuce? Those are out in the fields where there's feral pigs out there defecating on them. So that's the problem. That never happens in a greenhouse. So ours never has that kind of exposure. So we have to be extra cautious about that kind of waste. But the trick is when you do compost, you have to get it up to 180 degrees. That kills most all the seeds as well as any kind of pathogen. So that's important. And that's why you can go to the nursery and buy these thermometers with these real long stems on them to penetrate. I mean, when you got your compost percolating really well, you can't even put your hand in there. It's so hot.
Yeah.
It's very hot, yeah.
But that's in the summer, right?
No, that's the wintertime too.
That's even a
Yeah.
smaller compost? Like,
Yeah.
really?
Yeah, the smaller your pile, the less hot it'll get, the bigger your pile. You want to have your pile a minimum of 3 feet tall and 3 foot wide for it to really start percolating, preferably much bigger than that. But that's why these bins are basically 3 by 3 by 3.
Do they stink?
No, the compost, right away it just starts percolating. There's no smell to it at all. And once it's done, it just smells like fresh soil.
So I want to try to understand with the cardboard and the layers, how deep is that? I mean, I've got lots of, I just trimmed a bunch of trees today, we got all kinds of leaves and all kinds of stuff. How long does that have to sit before then you put the soil on top of it and use it?
You can use it right away.
Okay.
Yeah.
So where am I supposed to get soil that's not going to have any weeds in it?
If you buy bags of soil, you can do it that way. Or if you go to Jim Dirt sells soil, compost, different kinds of products like that by the truckload, or you can go with your pickup truck and get it a lot cheaper.
Okay. So I a couple of years ago, I went and got some mulch from the city of Tulsa. They have fine mulch, and I put it up, on the ground, and it actually kind of decomposed itself. But we used that in some of our raised beds. We put that on the very bottom, and then we put soil over the top of it. It seemed to work okay, but there's got to be weeds in that stuff.
Well, if you go to Jim Dirt, they windrow it into huge piles, and they make sure it composts correctly, like the leaf compost, where all the pathogens and seeds are killed. And also, you can go to the city dump. They're wood chipping branches and wood all the time, and you can get a free amounts of that. And if you put deep wood chips for your mulch, those wood chips deteriorate too.
Right.
How many have heard of the video out there called Eden Garden? Back to Eden. Yeah, that's a big promoter of wood chips, very deep, and how it turns into black topsoil in the end. That's all good stuff too. Did you have a question?
Yes, I have a question. So, is there any map or information about where you can find good land? Like the quality of the land, and like where are the good ones? Are you from next to the river? Quality land.
Where can you find quality land?
Yes, is there any map of Oklahoma where
The best land.
The best lands?
The best land is sandy loam, which is closer to the river.
Yeah.
But with this method, it really doesn't make a difference what your land is.
So even if you buy very poor quality
Yeah.
land, you can fix it up?
You can do it this way. Yeah. Now, if you have really good land, the roots can go deeper quicker, and that's still going to be benefit there. But with this method, making a raised bed on top of clay or poor soil, the topsoil that's grown there will enrich the soil itself. Yes.
You said you were going to talk about why you put the pieces of wood
On the north side. Because that creates the slant toward the south for the winter gardening. Yes.
So how deep is the raised bed?
Well, you wanna. It doesn't. There's no standard on that, but you want to have it a slant where at least you got over 10% grade toward the south. So you gotta. The wider your bed is, the higher it's going to be in the back. At the urban farm that we have in Midtown, we use timbers. We use 4x4 timbers, 6x6 timbers to build our raised beds. At my house, I just use branches to build the beds. There's different ways you can do it. But if you have the back of it higher than the front toward the south, then you create an environment that's going to be really good for winter gardening.
But you
If
know,
it gets-
sometimes
if you have
so
sun.
much cardboard, so much this, so much that. I mean, it doesn't have to be 18 inches deep or
No.
nothing okay.
Yeah. Whatever you've got to work with. Well, yes. Did you have one more question?
Do you use the red wriggler worm?
Yes. When we moved to our property, it was a new housing development and it was clay soil. They put a thin layer of poor topsoil on that. There was not one earthworm on that property. So I went to Walmart and they sell earthworms there. You can get red wigglers there or regular earthworms, night crawlers. They have them in the bait shops at the sporting goods. So you can buy them there. And I've done that to several properties. And now I have a half-acre property and they're everywhere. They really have multiplied because I'm feeding the soil. So, and they're really good.
On the sidewalk, I pick them up and put them on the grass.
My dog eats them.
That's great. Well, is there people here interested if we did one later in the year on aquaponics, hydroponics only? Okay, we'll plan that too. We'll plan that too then. And did everybody get a chance to sign the sheet to give me your email address so we can notify you? Okay. Now, all the lettuce that we passed around, I'd hate for anybody to eat. But but that my cooler back there is electrical, so it's keeping everything cold. So I have about, I don't know how many heads there. If anybody wants to bring some home with them, you sure can. But you're welcome to have that. Did you have a question, Jessica? Oh.
No, I just wanted to say if you get mulch from the city of Tulsa, do not put it close to your house because it's known for termites. So,
Really?
yes. So you want to have it away from your property because it's not treated at all. It's just raw wood.
Now, that brings up another topic. Have any of you ever had problem with ants getting in your house? Okay. In real rainy weather, they tend to get in more because they're trying to get out of the moisture. It's always been a struggle, but I found something that works. I put it down once, and it works for 10 years. And it's coffee grounds. It's coffee grounds. If you go to the coffee store, and they'll give you coffee grounds free, you put 2 inches wide, 1 inch or 2 high, and it's a barrier, whether it's wet or dry.
Just put it around
Uh-huh.
the
Exterior of your house, an unbroken line. And then you'll have to renew it after about 10 years. It's been our experience. But it also has ingredients in it that kind of fertilize your plants too. And that's good to add to your compost piles, is coffee grounds.
To add to that, I was just told, because I have a huge mold problem right now, someone just told me that you can get rid of molds with coffee grounds.
Well, good to know. Good.
Just spread them all over your lawn.
I don't waste any of my coffee grounds. I'll put them under my bushes, but I mainly put them on my compost pile or my my worm farming bin too. I've got one of those now. Yes? Anybody got any tricks for termites?
Feral cats out of your winter garden.
What's that?
How do you keep the feral cats you got out of your winter garden?
Well, I've not had a trouble with that, but if the squirrels are bad, if you keep your soil moist, they're not going to go defecate in your garden. They like dry soil. Cats do. So if you keep it wet, they're not going to defecate there.
And that second layer of cardboard that we plant like winter carrots, it'll go through there?
Yeah, that's a good point. I'm glad you mentioned that. When you put the cardboard down, you can either do transplants by cutting an X, pulling the mulch apart, making an X there with a knife, and then plant your plant there and then pull the mulch around it. If you do seed, you pull the mulch out in a long trench, take a knife, a box cutter, cut a slit in your cardboard, and then put about an inch of topsoil or mulch there, compost, and then plant your seeds. That way the seed roots can go down through the cardboard easy, because it's going to be a while before the cardboard's gone, and they need that slit to connect with the soil underneath it.
So the cardboard is actually, it's disintegrating.
Yes.
And so that's why 45 days later at harvest, you don't see any cardboard.
No.
It's just soil.
Yeah, and and the winter takes a little longer, but then the next spring, when you make a new garden, just put if there's anything growing there, just put cardboard over it. You don't even have to pull it out of the soil, and then put your mulch on top of that and plant again. Yeah. Yes.
Have you done anything with kobashi composting?
I haven't myself,
Just wondering.
but not much, not enough to. It'd take an awful lot of them to really make a difference. Yeah, it gives them nitrogen. It's a fertilizer. I guess we're done now, but I can still take personal questions. Thank you. Yes.